The Vorrkai Empire had catalogued 412 sentient species across the known galaxy, and not once, not a single time in 11,000 years of expansion, had any of them surprised us. Oh, they tried, of course. The Dranathi of Sector 7 waved their 17 limbs and made very loud noises about their ancient warrior traditions. The Philosi Collective sent diplomatic transmissions so long and complex that 3 of our translation drones simply gave up and retired. The Moonkai hive mind once threatened to consume the light itself, which was genuinely creative. We gave them points for creativity. They surrendered 2 days later when we blockaded their primary food moon. 412 species, not one surprise. And then, humanity. I want to be very clear about something before we proceed. The Vorrkai Empire is not small. We span 600 star systems. Our warships are 3 kilometers long and move between stars like needles through silk. Our High Commander Veeth Moran is the most decorated military mind in recorded galactic history, a being so strategically brilliant that other species write religious texts about his tactical manuals, not metaphorically. Literally, there is a cult on Drenos IV that worships his 3rd volume on orbital bombardment. We are, by every metric that matters, terrifying. I need you to hold on to that fact as this story gets increasingly embarrassing for us. The year was 2041 by the human calendar, which means nothing to you if you're Vorrkai. But the humans are very attached to their calendars, so we'll use it out of respect, and also because what follows is largely their story, and they deserve the courtesy. Our long-range scouts had been watching the Sol system for approximately 40 of their years. 40 years. Watching a species claw its way from burning fossil fuels to building their first genuine interstellar communication array, watching them argue about it the entire time, watching them nearly destroy themselves twice, once with something called social media, which our xenopsychologists still have not fully explained, and then somehow, improbably, stubbornly, pull back from the edge and keep building. Senior Scout Elavi Khan was the one who filed the initial report. She was 23 years into her posting, which meant she had been watching humans since they were still debating whether the planet was getting warmer. It was, obviously, anyone could see that, and she had developed what her supervisors generously called an unhealthy affection for the subject species. What her supervisors less generously called it was a professional liability. What she called it was paying attention. Her report landed on the desk of Fleet Admiral Vorrkai Empire, a being of considerable size, considerable age, and considerable irritation at anything that interrupted his afternoon meditation. He read Elavi's report. He read it again. He called her in personally, which was unusual, because Vorrkai Empire had not personally called in a junior scout since the Moonkai incident, and that time it was to ask who authorized the use of 37 capital ships to blockade a moon. "You're recommending," he said, very slowly, "the way beings speak when they are choosing their words carefully, because the alternative is screaming, that we make formal first contact." "Yes, sir," said Elavi. "With the humans?" "Yes, sir. The humans who, as of 14 months ago, were still engaged in 17 simultaneous armed conflicts with each other." 16, sir. One of them resolved. Vorrkai stared at her for a long time. "Khan," he said, "the standard threshold for first contact is a species that has achieved interstellar travel, or demonstrated unified planetary governance, or proven capacity for sustained non-aggression across a minimum of 3 decades. The humans have achieved none of these things. They've built a communicator that can reach us, sir, by accident. The Dranathi achieved interstellar travel by accident, sir. We still contacted them." Vorrkai was silent again. Then he did something that surprised Elavi considerably. He laughed. It was a short, dry sound, like something old and dusty getting knocked off a shelf. "Fine," he said. "Fine. We'll send a contact vessel. A small one. Class 7, nothing that will frighten them. With respect, sir, I've been watching them for 23 years. I'm not sure they frighten easily." He waved her concern away like a thing beneath consideration. He would remember that wave later, at length, in the dark, replaying it with considerable regret. The contact vessel assigned to the mission was the Saren Pale, a Class 7 diplomatic cruiser, long and silver and elegant, exactly the kind of ship designed to say we come in peace without saying we also have weapons that could sterilize your atmosphere. Though both things were true. The crew included Elavi as cultural liaison, which was more than she had expected, and first contact specialist Drovan Ket, who had handled 7 previous first contacts and found them uniformly straightforward, and Captain Yilin Strahl, who was professional and efficient and had absolutely no patience for the unexpected. The Saren Pale dropped out of slip transit at the edge of the Sol system on a Tuesday. The humans, as it turned out, would find this detail important later, because humans are very attached to Tuesdays being terrible, and they would spend considerable time debating whether it was a sign. They were detected within 11 minutes. Elavi had expected this to take longer. The detection array humanity had built was, by galactic standards, rudimentary, a network of deep space sensors strung together with what she could only describe as optimism and determination, not unlike the humans themselves. But it worked, and when it pinged something large and silver, and decidedly not natural sitting at the edge of their solar system, the response was rapid. Not panicked, she noted carefully. Rapid. There is a difference, and she had learned to spot it. 3 hours after detection, they received a transmission. Drovan Ket was in the middle of preparing the standard first contact package. Greetings in 46 languages, mathematical proofs of intelligence, peaceful iconography drawn from the subject species' own cultural imagery. When the communication console lit up and a voice came through in clear, accented, entirely comprehensible galactic standard, everyone on the bridge stopped moving. "Unknown vessel," said the voice, and it was calm. It was measured. It had the very specific quality of a person who is deeply alarmed and choosing, consciously, not to show it. "This is Lieutenant Commander Priya Vasek of the United Nations Space Monitoring Division. We have detected your arrival, and we want you to know that Earth is open to communication. Please respond." Drovan Ket turned slowly to look at Elavi Khan. Elavi Khan had the expression of someone who has been saying "I told you so" for 23 years, and is now physically restraining herself from saying it again. "They," Ket started, "learned galactic standard from the signal array," Elavi said. "Yes, it took them about 8 months. 8 months. They're fast learners." Captain Strahl straightened in her command seat. "Respond," she said. What followed was, by official record, the shortest first contact negotiation in Vorrkai history. Most first contacts took weeks. The Dranathi had taken 4 months just to agree on a location for the first meeting. The Pholosi Collective had sent 17 counter-proposals before consenting to a simple greeting. The Moonkai had tried to eat the first ambassador, which set things back considerably. Humanity agreed to a meeting in 40 minutes, asked if they needed to provide coordinates or if the Vorrkai had the tech to find them, and Elavi genuinely had to check the transmission log 3 times to confirm this, asked if anyone on board had dietary restrictions. Dietary restrictions. They were asking an alien species, on first contact, if they needed to arrange catering. Drovan Ket sat down heavily in his chair. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "Welcome to 23 years of my life," said Elavi. The meeting was arranged for a location in low Earth orbit, a neutral point above the planet's equator, and the humans sent up a vessel to meet them. Small, boxy, unmistakably functional, over-elegant, the kind of ship that said "we built this to work, not to impress you," and aboard it were 3 representatives, Lieutenant Commander Priya Vasek, who had spoken on the radio, a man named Obasi Tern, identified as a xenolinguist, which Elavi found remarkable because it implied humanity had been training linguists for this moment for some time, and a woman named Sorel Madaki, described in the briefing documents as lead negotiator, who stepped through the docking connector onto the Saren Pale, looked around at the interior, the arching walls, the bioluminescent panels, the air scrubbers that hummed at a frequency slightly below human hearing, and said, "Nice ship," with an expression of complete composure, not performance, not bravado, composure. Elavi felt something shift in her assessment, something that had been building for 23 years, finally completing itself. She had always thought she was watching a species learn to survive. She was starting to think she had been watching something considerably more interesting. The talks lasted 6 hours. By standard first contact metrics, this was extremely fast. By the end of the 2nd hour, Sorel Madaki had identified 3 potential areas of mutual resource interest. By hour 4, Obasi Tern had engaged Drovan Ket in a side conversation about linguistic drift in interstellar translation, that Ket would later describe, privately, as the most stimulating academic discussion of his career. By hour 5, Priya Vasek had gently, diplomatically, with a smile that was friendly and contained absolutely no give, asked about the Vorrkai's territorial boundaries in the systems adjacent to Sol. Captain Strahl had leaned slightly toward Alavi at that point, and murmured, very quietly, "They're negotiating." Yes, Alavi had confirmed. On first contact. Yes. They haven't even agreed to the friendship protocols yet. No, they skipped them. Strahl was quiet for a moment. Should I be concerned? Alavi considered the question with the weight it deserved. She thought about 23 years of watching. She thought about a species that had survived itself, repeatedly, by sheer collective stubbornness. She thought about Sorel Madaki, asking about territorial boundaries with that particular quality of smile. She thought about dietary restrictions. "I think," she said carefully, that concerned might be the right word. Not afraid, just attentive. They returned the humans to their ship and watched the small, boxy vessel descend back toward the blue-green planet below, and Alavi stood at the observation port and watched it go, and she thought about the report she would have to file, and the words she would have to choose, and how to explain to Fleet Admiral Vorrkai soon that first contact had gone well, technically, measurably, objectively well, and also that she had a feeling, a very specific and carefully considered feeling, that the Vorrkai Empire had just met someone who was going to matter. She didn't know yet how much. She didn't know yet in what direction. She only knew that 412 species had come before, and not one of them had asked about catering. Number 413 had, and number 413 was just getting started. The report Alavi Khan filed was, by her own admission, the most carefully worded document she had ever produced. She had written it 4 times. The first version was too enthusiastic. Her supervisor had once warned her about enthusiasm in official documentation, saying it made the readers nervous. The second version was too clinical, which stripped out the details that actually mattered. The third version was honest, which was somehow worse than both. The fourth version was what she submitted, measured, precise, and containing between every line the quiet insistence that someone at a senior level needed to pay attention to this particular species. Fleet Admiral Vorrkai read it in his office with the particular stillness of a being who is recalibrating. He then did something that Alavi had not anticipated. He forwarded it directly to High Commander Vethmoran. Now, Vethmoran was not a being who involved himself in first contact proceedings. He was a being who involved himself in outcomes, in the broad, strategic, civilization-shaping sense of the word. He had not personally reviewed a first contact file in 60 years. The last time he had, it was because the subject species had developed weapons capable of threatening Vorrkai core systems. The Moonkai, incidentally, had not been that species. That species was the Drenathi. And the situation had resolved itself after a very long and very expensive standoff that Vethmoran still did not enjoy discussing. He read Alavi's report. Then he read the attached transcripts from the 6-hour meeting. Then he read the xenopsychological profile she had compiled over 23 years of observation, which was 600 pages long and footnoted with the kind of obsessive thoroughness that either meant she was brilliant or had simply been alone in deep space too long. Possibly both. He called Vorrkai. "Tell me about the negotiator," he said. "The one called Madaki." Vorrkai had expected many opening questions. That was not one of them. "She's a diplomat, apparently well regarded among their various national factions. She asked about our territorial boundaries on first contact." Yes, a pause. "She wasn't afraid. None of them appeared to be, sir." Scout Khan has noted this as a consistent behavioral pattern across the species. They process fear differently than most sentient species. They appear to feel it and then set it aside. Functionally, another pause, longer. "I want a second meeting," Vethmoran said. "Larger delegation. I want to see this myself." Vorrkai had been in service long enough to recognize when a superior had decided something and was phrasing it as a preference. "Of course, sir. I'll have Khan arrange it." "And Vorrkai," the voice shifted, slightly. "Don't tell them who I'm sending." The second delegation arrived at Earth orbit 3 weeks later, and it was considerably less subtle than the first. Where the Seren Pale had been elegant and deliberately unimposing, the new vessel, the Vorrkai diplomatic carrier Solemn Reach, was 300 meters of unmistakable institutional authority, the kind of ship that other species tended to receive and then spend several days quietly reconsidering their positions. It had served this purpose reliably across 100 diplomatic engagements. Priya Vasek was back on comms when they arrived. She looked at the sensor readout of the Solemn Reach according to her own later account for approximately 4 seconds. Then she said, "Good morning. We'll need a slightly larger shuttle." Aboard the Solemn Reach, an aide named Vren Sulo, 22 years old and 11 days into his first posting, turned to his senior and said, "Did she just—" "Yes," said his senior. "Is that normal?" His senior thought about it. "Apparently," she said, "for them." The delegation that came up from Earth this time was 7 people. Sorel Madaki was back, in a different jacket, with the same composure. Obasi Tern was back, carrying a data tablet so thoroughly annotated it looked like it had survived something. 2 new faces, a man named Caius Ferro, introduced as a specialist in interstellar trade law, which implied, again, remarkably, that humanity had been developing interstellar trade law in anticipation of needing it, and a woman named UN Parata, who was identified simply as strategic advisor, and who said almost nothing for the first 2 hours, and watched everything with the quality of attention that made the Vorrkai delegates subtly uncomfortable without being able to explain why. The 7th member of the human delegation was a teenager. His name was Remy Oduya. He was 16 years old. He was, they explained, a student who had won something called a global science competition with a paper on xenolinguistic probability matrices, and humanity had decided to bring him along. They had brought a child to a second-tier diplomatic meeting with an interstellar empire. Drovan Ket, who had returned for this meeting because no force in the known galaxy could have kept him away at this point, stared at Remy Oduya for a long moment, and then looked at Elawavi with an expression that she would later describe in her personal logs as a being reaching the limits of his professional framework. Remy Oduya looked back at Ket with open, unguarded curiosity, pulled out a notebook, a physical notebook, paper, with a pen, and said, in careful Galactic standard with a slight accent that Ket found genuinely charming, "Can I ask you about tonal shift patterns in Vorrkai formal register? I have a theory that the written form dropped 2 phonemic layers about 3,000 years ago, and I can't find anything to confirm it." Ket sat down across from him. The formal agenda was momentarily suspended. Nobody stopped them. This is the part of the story where I should mention what was happening in the secondary conference room aboard the Solemn Reach, because the real meeting was not the one with the full delegations. The real meeting was the one that Veth Moran had arranged quietly, the one that only 4 people knew about in advance, the one where he sat across from Sorel Madaki and UN Parata, with only Alavi present as interpreter, though Madaki's galactic standard was, at this point, better than some native speakers Alavi had met, which was frankly unsettling, and spoke plainly. "You understand what we are," he said. It was not a question. "We have a reasonable picture," Sorel Madaki said. 600 systems. The largest military force in this region of the galaxy. Older than your civilization by 11,000 years. He paused. "Most species, when they understand this, adjust their behavior." "Adjust how?" she asked. And her tone was genuinely curious rather than challenging, which was somehow more unnerving than challenge would have been. "They become careful," Veth Moran said. "Deferential. They recognize the shape of power, and they orient themselves accordingly. It is," he said, "a rational response." Sorel Madaki considered this with the particular quality of someone weighing a thing honestly, rather than performing consideration. Then she said, "We're familiar with the shape of power. We've had a lot of it, internally, for a very long time. Different kinds." She paused. "I don't think deference is what you actually want from us." The room was very quiet. Elavi, who had been watching Veth Moran for the 17 years she'd served under his remote authority, saw something cross his face that she had never seen there before. It wasn't surprise it was the expression of a being who had asked a question expecting a specific answer and received instead the correct one. "No," he said, after a moment. "It isn't." UN Parata, who had said nothing for 2 hours, spoke for the first time. "You've contacted 400 species," she said. It wasn't a question either. She had clearly read something somewhere, which raised its own set of questions about what humanity's intelligence networks had assembled in 3 weeks. And you're here personally for number 413. Veth Moran looked at her steadily. Yes. Why? He was quiet for long enough that Alavi began to wonder if she should interject. Then he said something that she would turn over in her mind for the rest of her career. Something that she would quote in 3 separate academic papers and 1 memoir that was technically classified but widely read anyway. He said, "Because the others were species I understood, and I have not yet decided what you are." What followed over the next 6 hours was not exactly a negotiation, and not exactly a first contact, and not exactly a strategic assessment. It was all 3 at once, conducted in the particular register of people who are being honest with each other, because they have independently calculated that honesty is more efficient than performance. Veth Moran asked about the 17 conflicts that had been ongoing 3 years prior. Sorel Madaki explained them with a candor that was almost aggressive. Yes, this is what we do. Yes, we're aware it's inefficient. Yes, we are nevertheless still here. UN Parata laid out, without being asked, humanity's current military capabilities, their realistic development trajectory, and the 3 scenarios under which they would consider a Vorrkai presence in their system a threat. 3 scenarios. Specific, pre-calculated, with Alavi noted, contingencies attached. Veth Moran looked at the contingencies for a long moment. "You've been preparing for this," he said. "We've been preparing for something," Madaki said. "We didn't know it would be you specifically. You weren't afraid." It was the same thing he'd said to Thavrak, and Madaki caught the weight of it. She thought about her answer for a moment in the way that suggested she was choosing truth over diplomacy. "We were afraid," she said. "We're afraid right now, in the sense that this matters, and we know it matters. But we've spent a long time figuring out that fear is information, not instruction." Alavi Khan wrote that down. She wrote it down immediately, in the margin of her official notes, and she put a mark next to it that she used for things she intended to remember for a very long time. Fear is information, not instruction. In the main conference room, Remy Oduya had by this point covered 14 pages of his notebook and was talking so fast that Drovan Ket had given up keeping pace and was simply listening with the helpless delight of someone encountering a mind that genuinely excited him. Caius Pharaoh had produced a 40-page preliminary framework for trade engagement that the Vorrkai trade delegation was reading with expressions ranging from impressed to slightly alarmed by its specificity. Obasi Tern had, somehow, gotten into a friendly argument with 3 Vorrkai linguists about the classification of a disputed language family that had been unresolved for 200 years, and the argument had the warm, combative quality of people who were going to be corresponding about this for decades. Priya Vasek had asked quietly and to nobody in particular whether there was coffee available, and a Vorrkai aide had spent 20 minutes researching what coffee was and then replicated something that was approximately 40% accurate, which Vasek drank without complaint and described as interesting. When the delegations finally separated and the human shuttle descended again toward the blue-white planet below, Veth Moran stood at the observation port of the Solemn Reach in a way that Alavi recognized. It was the posture of a being finishing a thought. "Well?" she asked, because she had earned the right, over 23 years, to ask. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "File the formal recognition papers. Full membership track, not provisional." Alavi blinked. Full membership track took most species 40 years minimum. The Dranathi had waited 60. "Sir, the council will want justification. Tell them," he said, still watching the shuttle shrink toward the blue curve of Earth, "that we found a species that treats fear as information." He paused, "and that they brought a child to a diplomatic meeting, and it was the correct tactical decision, and I want to understand the civilization that knew that." Ilavavi Khan looked down at the planet. 4,700,000,000 humans, arguing and building and surviving, and apparently, in 3 weeks, assembling a framework for interstellar trade law. And she thought about 23 years of watching, and how it had felt, sometimes, like waiting for something she couldn't name. She knew what it was now. She'd been waiting for the galaxy to meet someone it hadn't met before. 412 species, and not one surprise. Number 413 brought a teenager, and asked about catering, and somewhere in the senior archives of the Vorrkai Empire, in a file that would eventually become required reading at the Imperial Military Academy, Alavi Khan wrote the final line of her 23-year observation report. It read, "I recommend full engagement. These people are not what we expected. I believe that is precisely the point." She was right. She was, as it turned out, more right than even she knew. But that is a story for another time, and humanity characteristically, stubbornly, magnificently, was only just getting started.